So in this demonstration, I'll show you how to create a virtual switch, create a virtual hard disk, and create a virtual machine. To create a virtual switch, open Hyper-V Manager, and then having selected the appropriate host, over in the Actions pane, click Virtual Switch Manager. Choose what type of switch. External means that you can communicate with the physical network adapters in this host computer. Internal means only the host and the virtual machines can access the switch. Or private, which means only the virtual machines that are running on this host can access the network. Let's choose private and then click Create Virtual Switch. You need to give it a name. And then click OK. To create a virtual hard disk in Hyper-V Manager, click New in the Actions pane and then choose Hard Disk. You can choose between VHD, VHDX, which is the default, or VHD set. VHD is the older format of virtual hard disk. VHDX should be your default value now. You can choose between a fixed size, which provides for better performance, or dynamically expanding. Dynamically expanding allows you to specify a particular size up to which the disk will grow as needed. You can also choose a differencing disk. A differencing disk requires you to define the relationship between this disk and its parent. That can be useful if you're creating virtual machines, all of which have a common pedigree. So they're all fairly similar, perhaps built from the same source, and then customized accordingly. We'll choose dynamically expanding. The next thing we need to specify is the location. I'm going to accept the default. You can configure the default through the properties of the host itself. Right click the host up here in the console and choose the settings. So I'm going to call this a new virtual hard disk. Now I can either create a blank disk, the default, or I can copy the contents of a specified physical disk to the new disk, or I can copy the contents of a specified virtual hard disk. I'm just going to go with create a new blank hard disk. The summary screen shows me what I've selected and I click Finish. If you're using Windows 10 Enterprise, you can also create a virtual hard disk through Computer Management. On the Disk Management node, right-click and choose Create VHD. You can then attach a VHD, in other words, mount it into the file system. This is useful if you're configuring boot to VHD on a host. The next logical step is to create a new virtual machine. In the Actions pane, click New, choose Virtual Machine, and then enter a name. I'm going to go for Test VM. You can specify where you want to store the virtual machine. The default is wherever you've configured on the Hyper-V host. Again, you right-click the host itself and specify the default location for virtual machines. I'm going to accept the default. You specify it as a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 next. The generation determines what type of guest operating systems you can run. Gen 1 supports both 32-bit and 64-bit guests. But Gen 2 supports more modern firmware options and requires a 64-bit guest operating system. Generally, unless you have a very good reason, choose Gen 2. When you assign the memory, you can configure a startup amount of memory, and then you can configure whether you want to enable dynamic memory. If you disable dynamic memory, the startup memory is the maximum allocatable amount. If you choose dynamic, you can allow that to grow to a threshold that you can configure later. Define whether or not the device is connected to a virtual switch. And then you can create a virtual hard disk, or you can select an existing hard disk. Here's the one that we created earlier. Or you can attach the hard disk later. On the summary screen, it gives us an indication of the options we've selected. If you right-click the VM and choose Settings, you can configure the properties for the VM. You can add hardware at the top here, including a SCSI controller, another network adapter, a remote FX 3D video adapter, a fiber channel adapter. You can specify the startup order. At the moment we have two options, network adapter and hard drive. But if we were, for example, to add a SCSI DVD drive, then we could choose to boot from that. Let's take a look at that. If I click on the SCSI controller and add a DVD drive and point the DVD drive to an ISO for Windows 10 here, and then click apply, I've then got the option under firmware to boot from the DVD drive first by shuffling the order using the move up, move down buttons. I can enable security features such as secure boot. I can also enable a TPM, and I can encrypt state and virtual machine migration traffic and enable shielding. Those are some of the options we'll talk about in another unit. So on the network, I can enable certain features as well, bandwidth management and so on, and I can reconfigure which virtual switch the network interface is connected to. When I'm happy with that, I can click OK. To run a virtual machine, you click it in the list, and then on the right hand side you can click Start, or if you prefer, right click and choose Start from the context menu. You can also connect to the virtual machine before it's running or after it's running by clicking Connect, and then you can start or stop the virtual machine using the navigation buttons here. So in the demonstration you saw how to create a virtual switch, a virtual hard disk and a virtual machine. Checkpoints allow you to capture a point in time for your virtual machine configuration and the virtual hard disks. To enable a checkpoint, right-click the appropriate virtual machine in the Hyper-V Manager console and then click Checkpoint. To apply a checkpoint, navigate to the Checkpoints node, right-click the appropriate checkpoint and click Apply. In this demonstration, I'll show you how to create a checkpoint, how to revert a virtual machine, and how to apply a checkpoint. Now, if I don't create a checkpoint in my virtual machine, there's no way for me to roll the virtual machine back to a point in time. Now, that may be totally appropriate in a production environment. You don't necessarily want to roll your virtual machines back. But on Windows 10, since it's a client operating system, it's quite likely you'll be using virtual machines for test situations. So you may well want to roll them back to a particular point in time. The virtual machines you see here listed, CL1, CL2, and so on. These are the ones that I use for training purposes, and so I always want to get to a particular point in time. You can see on Pearson DC1 there's been a large number of checkpoints created, if you look in the center of the pane here, during the development of some training materials. So it's a good idea to start out by creating a checkpoint for your just created virtual machine. It's easy enough to do. You right click and choose Checkpoint. I now have the ability to roll back the machine to a given point in time. Actually, there's no difference between the current state of the machine and the checkpoint, but that doesn't matter. The principle is the same. I can now choose to revert the virtual machine to a point in time. I'm prompted, am I sure I wanted to do that? And I can then choose revert or don't revert as appropriate. If there are several checkpoints that you've got, let's create another one. You can then choose to apply a specific one. To roll back to the latest checkpoint, you right-click your virtual machine and choose Revert. But if you want to apply a specific checkpoint, so perhaps an earlier one, you can right-click an earlier checkpoint and choose Apply. Windows wants to check you really mean to do that because you will lose all of the changes subsequently. So do you want to create a checkpoint and apply the checkpoint you've selected, or you just want to apply it? Well, I'm just going to apply it. And you can see now the current state is indicated with the Now graphic here, the little green triangle, as being an earlier checkpoint. To apply the later checkpoint, I right-click it and choose Apply. Now, if you take a look at the file system and drive D, under the Hyper-V folder, you can see a number of files. We've got the original hard disk for this virtual machine, and we've got some checkpoint files listed here. Okay, now you don't work with these files directly. You don't delete these files, or you don't try to rename the files. You'll end up corrupting your virtual machine's configuration. But you can see that these are starting to consume a bit of space. As it happens, these are very, very small files at the moment. But when you start working with a virtual machine, tens of gigabytes is not unusual. And so multiple checkpoint files will consume lots of disk space. If you're fairly satisfied with the current state of your virtual machine and you want to get rid of the checkpoint files, the way to do that is to right click and choose Delete Checkpoint. And then the same again, delete checkpoint. If you have multiple checkpoints, you can choose the delete checkpoint tree option. And you can see briefly, it says that it's merging the checkpoint files. What it does is it takes the changes that have been created in the subsequent checkpoints and applies them. So in other words, the virtual machine state moves up to the latest checkpoint. And you can see that reflected in the file system. We now have a more recent hard disk timestamp, and the additional checkpoint files have been deleted. So you saw how to create a checkpoint, revert a virtual machine, and how to apply a checkpoint. Integration settings for your virtual machine enable you to do things such as control operating system shutdown, time synchronization, data exchange, heartbeat, backup via the Volume Shadow Copy service, and guest services. From time to time, it may be necessary for you to move a virtual machine's storage, for example, to another computer. To do this, open up the Hyper-V Manager console, right-click the virtual machine, and then choose Move. You're prompted for the type. What type of move do you want to perform? Move the virtual machine's storage. That's the typical activity. Then you're asked for options, moving all of the virtual machine's data to a single location, move the virtual machine's data to different locations, or move only the virtual machine's virtual hard disks, leaving the configuration where it is.